weird thing is that I am coming to you live from what used to be my parents' bedroom. And I have just in the last few months turned it into an office because I needed one. The kitchen table was not cutting it.
No.
I've run into a couple of issues with it, some structural issues. I've got to get part of this room jacked up before I can finish. We were talking about time and thinking that mom and dad were coming back because that's what it feels like. And I've talked to a couple of other people who feel the same way. Like you feel like they're just gone on a trip somewhere
Yeah.
and they'll be back.
Yeah.
And for the longest time, probably about 2 years after my dad died, the bedroom was still as they left it. And every time I walked past the room, I was like, it's mom and dad's bedroom. That's what I thought of it. And so I switched the furniture around. I moved the bed to the other wall. I moved my dad's chest of drawers. Like I moved stuff around. And then last year, I was like, I don't have enough closet space or storage space for because all of my winter stuff was still in storage bins upstairs in the garage. I was
Mhm.
like, I don't have room for any of my clothes in this house. And I was like, I walked past this room one day and I just stopped and I looked and I was like, mom and dad don't need their dressers anymore. I mean, mom had been gone 5 years. My dad had been gone 4 years.
Yeah.
And it just occurred to me, hey, you know what? I can use their furniture
Yeah.
because I guess I was still thinking, no, that's theirs. They're going to use it.
It's the fact that you still think that that is their furniture. That's still their room. And even as you speak now, since the beginning, that's still their house
Mhm,
or this house.
mhm.
I don't think you once said your house.
No, because that's weird.
Yeah. And
And you know what's weird about that being weird? My grandparents built this house in 1968. We swapped houses with my grandparents and moved up here in 1986 when I was 6 years old.
yeah.
I have now lived in this house longer than anyone else, longer than my grandparents or my parents.
Yeah.
But yet it still doesn't feel like my house. It's so strange. And even now, like my dad left me mom's car, and I still call it mom's car. He also left me his little four-wheel drive truck so I can get up and down the driveway. He
Right.
gave me his little truck. I still call it dad's truck,
Well,
mom's car.
admittedly, like the house next to mom's, it's so much easier to describe, hey, I left some food down at Nana's house.
Yeah. Yeah.
People know what you're talking about.
That's true.
Oh, I'm taking mom's car today. I won't be in dad's truck. They'll know what you're talking about.
It's just, and I don't know. I talked to a friend of mine. She's older than me. Her mom passed away several years ago. It took her 7 years to clean out her mother's house.
Yeah.
Like it was left as is. It took her 7 years. And I've talked to other people who are like, nope, at 6 months, you gotta get this cleaned out. Or at a year,
I
you gotta get this cleaned out.
I was so adamant. I
And I'm like,
was I was almost angry when, I know that my grandmother had passed, but it's like the house it was just untouched, untouched. Nothing had moved. Like I don't even think the carpets had been vacuumed. And it had been years. I'm like, if anything, I can at least clean out the attic. And that was the catalyst. It was the catalyst of actually, okay,
yeah.
let's clean some more stuff out.
Is there anything there that you haven't cleaned out? Like, is there anything that's still
I've touched everything in that house.
So there's nothing that's still there that, she would have
Oh, no.
left that's untouched.
Unless it's in the walls, I've touched everything in that house. Now, mind you, the walls have been painted,
Yeah.
things have been covered up, ceilings have been replaced that were falling, crumbling, carpet had been pulled up that was rotted and decayed. The house got its renovations that needed to be renovated, or else it was going to be a much more costly thing down the road. But pictures are still up on the wall where they used to be. Cabinets are still where they're supposed to be. Things are still like the color may have changed. Things may be washed and cleaned and
Mhm.
a little bit different. But a lot of the major stuff is still there. The bedroom suit still there.
Mhm.
You know, that one room isn't full of QVC boxes anymore. And the original bed that was in there is back in there.
Mhm.
But it's also become like stuff for my stepdad's mom. The things that he got from her house.
Yeah.
That lived in that house. And it's hard enough to think of it as a museum.
You talk about the attic being a catalyst. For me, and I think I think God knew what he was doing when he did this, because otherwise I would not have cleaned out the house so soon. The weekend that my dad died, I was having a tremendous mouse problem in the house. Huge problem. So much so that my dad passed away on Monday afternoon. On Saturday afternoon, my brother was here. We had everything pulled out in the kitchen pantry because mice were getting in there and we didn't know how. And I mean, it was to the point of where you would be sitting in the kitchen and you could hear the mice also eating in the pantry. And I was catching like, a mouse every other day. And we're like, where are they coming from? And it was suddenly just
I'm
mice everywhere.
I'm going to stop you right there.
Go ahead.
Was it because the house was empty?
No, because I was living here. We were living here.
I know. I know.
Not as many people. Yeah, mom wasn't doing her thing.
I mean,
It could have been. I mean,
I
mom cooked more
you know,
than I did.
there's a certain no, but like the fact
There's not as much movement.
when a person is suddenly alone in a house,
Mm,
they start to recognize more of the bumps and groans and
yeah.
the way the house talks and
Mm.
things moving in the walls and in the attic. And is that really what's going on? Is that really what's happening? And I'm wondering if that was just like, were the mice, had the mice been there? Or was this just a sudden influx
It
because of
Well, I tell you, it got a whole lot worse after my dad died. Like, it was to the point where, I have my dog cameras in the house.
right?
And I was at work one day and the dogs, I kept getting these barking alerts. I'm like, what is going on? And I tried to see on the cameras, like they just kept barking at the door. And it was so worrisome that my sister-in-law was on her way home and I called her and I'm like, "Hey, can you just run up to the house and just see if there's anybody at the house? See what's going on. The dogs keep barking nonstop at the door." She drove up there and she's like, "No, there's nobody there." I was like, "That's weird." So I left work and I came home. There were 5 mice. It was a mama and babies. She was trying to move them in under one of mom's cabinets. This really large, like, china hutch thing that she had in the den. Mama trying to move the babies, and the dogs were barking at these mice in under the cabinet. Within 2 months after my dad died, I caught 30 mice, at least minimum 30 mice. It was an infestation,
Yeah.
and I finally figured out that they were coming in through an old dryer vent. opening on the outside of the house.
Right.
So finally fixed that, got it plugged up because I was finding bird seed everywhere. I mean, I had bird feeders outside, but I was finding bird seed in the house. Like, where's this bird seed coming from? The mice were bringing it in. So the mice made nice little homes in a couch. Actually, it was my great grandmother's couch that mom had out in the sunroom. They made a nice little hole, drilled right on through it, through that foam, and they made a nice little nest in there. Had to toss that. They made a nice little nest in mom's couch that was in the living room.
Yeah.
I mean, and these were rooms that, because mom wasn't here anymore, my dad wasn't here, nobody was going into these rooms.
Right.
These
And
rooms were empty. I was in the kitchen, the den, the bathroom, my bedroom. Like, that was it. Those were the rooms I was in. So all of these other rooms that were just sitting, the mice were taking over. Then I found out I had mold. I mean, because of course,
of course.
the these are the plagues that hit me after my dad died, right? Like, you have mice, you have mold. I had to get the foundation fixed because there was such a water problem in under the house.
Infrastructure.
I mean, it was
Road.
just and ironically, this room that I'm in, what was mom and dad's bedroom, I had to have a dehumidifier in here because the mold was worse in this room than any other room of the house. Because mom, when she was going through radiation, when she had breast cancer, she plugged up the floor registers for the air vents
Right.
because she was cold all the time. So instead of putting on more clothes, instead of turning the air back or the heat up, she's put on more clothes. Or she didn't put on more clothes. She plugged up the vents. So because of that, it caused a moisture problem in this room. The window where my dad, he sat at his desk, and the window right next to his desk, he always kept the curtains closed. The air vent that mom plugged up was right below that window. When I finally came in this room about a year after he died and I was cleaning stuff, I opened those curtains and there was black mold all over the window. The man died from lung cancer and he was not a smoker. So I'll just let you guess how he got that, however you want to.
Right.
Yeah, and by the way, all of the windows in this house have been replaced since that, like, had to. So all of those things, I mean, we talked about complicated grief. And, grief, a lot of people think that grief is the loss of a person. And it's
Oh,
not.
God.
You can grieve so many things. Anytime you lose anything. And and grief too, it's not just losing that person. It's all of these other secondary losses. It's it's everything else that happens. Everything else that you lose. It's so difficult to explain that to people.
But grief isn't just sadness, right? Grief is fear and happiness and joy and
And anger.
anger. It's
Oh,
all of those things.
there are so many times where I would get so angry at if I found something that mom did or didn't do in this house, or if I found something that my dad did or didn't do. I'm like, it's a simple fix. And I would just get so angry. And I'm like, because, and I just say this about my dad a lot of times, as far as maintenance goes with a house, he never had forward thinking with this house. It was,
Right.
how can I fix this right now for right now?
Right.
It's, hey, how can I fix this to where it never has to be fixed ever again? There was never that type of thinking.
Right.
So there are so many things that he, metaphorically duct taped around here over the last 40 years
Yeah.
that's now falling apart
Yeah.
and seems to be all at once that I'm having to go back and fix. And that on top of them just not being here. It's like, come on. I did not ask for this. I did not ask for this life.
Right.
This is, and you ask anyone who's ever lost anyone, spouse, mother, father, brother, sister, child, you you never think this is what your life's going to be. You could never in a million years, even if you know you're going to lose somebody, you don't know what it's going to be like. You don't. My mom died 6 years ago today. In that moment, I knew she was dying, but I didn't know what that meant. I I knew that she was passing away in that moment. We were all there when she did. We were there when my dad passed away, which I realize I'm very fortunate to have had the opportunity to be there when each of my parents died. I mean, like, I know a lot of people don't get that,
Yeah.
but you don't realize in that moment what that means.
Right.
Because I even remember in the hours after she died, still not fully understanding what just happened. And mom had been laying there in a hospital bed in the house for a week. I knew it was coming, but I still didn't understand it. You still cannot believe that they're actually just gone. It's just such a weird, and again, that goes back to time. Like, it's such a weird concept.
Yes. Little things that they've left with you to fix.
And
And
then
reminding you that they're still there.
and and you understand this well too because of family. They also left me a bunch of stuff.
Mhm.
Like, my mother was raised by her grandmother, who was born in 1900. She lived through 2 world wars, the death of her first husband in World War I. She lived through the Great Depression, and this is the lady who raised my mother.
Yeah.
So my mother never threw anything away. We
Nothing.
saved everything. I mean, tubs of plastic containers of butter, the butter tub, sour cream. I cannot tell you how many plastic tubs I've tossed in recycling. Magazines, my mother never threw a magazine away from 1960 something up until she died. She saved aluminum foil, um, boxes. She saved a lot of boxes because it's a good box. Don't want to get rid of that box. So I've taken a lot of stuff to recycling or trash. But yeah, it's you lose them, but then you're left with all of their stuff. And I have had a lot of conversations with other people who have lost someone, be it their parents or whoever. And I've had a lot of conversations with parents, older people that I know, and I tell them, hey, look, if there's something you want to leave your kids, ask them now if they want it. Because I found out there are a lot of people that don't want stuff, and give it to them now. Don't wait. My parents seem to be under the impression that we had to wait until the reading of the will to know what was left us. Like some, you know, 1800 type of will reading that and it was just like, no, let's discuss this.
It's I've noticed this with not just my parents, but with especially with us at our age, and
Mhm.
somehow everything seems to go along like it's just scripted, like it's being scripted.
Mhm.
It's like they had their life and then they put it in the executive room and everybody put their hands in and said, no, 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 you need to have it would make more of a dramatic scene if there was a reading of the will.
And it's,
If there
they discussed some stuff with us and with me and asked me questions about certain things. But my mom was so specific down to like a chair. I want to leave this chair to this person, or I want to leave this book to this person.
Right.
Okay, but why don't you just go ahead and give it to them now or ask them if they want it? It's like my mom wanted to leave my nephew this chair that belonged to what would be my great grandfather. And it's not a special chair. Okay, it's not. But my nephew, when he was little, he liked to sit in it. So therefore, mom wanted to leave it to him. And my nephew was like, I don't want that chair. He's like, I, I don't want that chair. So
Yeah.
I'll have that chair. It's in the den. I have that chair. But the cat likes to sit in it. But it's just, I don't know. It just seems like there are better solutions because a lot of that adds to the stress of grief. It adds to the complications that I'm already going through with grief.
I'm I was at the hospital this afternoon visiting my stepfather, and my mom was also there. And we were talking about Groundhog's Day. She goes, tomorrow will be this 17th year since Granddaddy has died. And Rick, my stepfather, goes, 17 years. That means my dad's been gone 15 years. And like the look of time,
Mhm.
it's a very yeah, there's a very specific look that people get when talking about time and grief.
You know, my dad was obsessed with time after my mom died, down to the minute. And I can remember him saying, like, he would look at the calendar and see what the date was, and he'd be like, well, this time, and he'd wait for 2:30 because mom died at 2:30 on the dot. And he would wait for 2:30 and he'd be like, well, this time, 18 days ago at 2:30, she passed away. Yep. And I mean, and he did that. He marked every month after she died. Um, and he made it to 14 months after she died because he died on April 13th. She died on February 2nd. And I remember him on April 2nd of, just a couple weeks before he died saying, well, it's been 14 months. Like and it started to, after a while, it just really grated on me because he would do it like every week. And I think that's what bugged me too, is that he could talk about her.
Right.
But if I started to bring her up, or if I started to say something about mom, or if I started to tell a story, he got very upset. And a lot of people don't know this about my dad. But he got pretty mad at me a couple of times when I started saying, talking about mom or bringing up a story about mom or mom would have, liked so and so. And there were a couple of times I was in the middle of talking and he left the room. Okay. Um, and so I would just sit there. But he it was just so I remember, so my parents used to go to Cracker Barrel every Saturday when my dad would get off work. He'd get off work at noon. He'd come home, change clothes. They'd leave. They'd drive up to Cracker Barrel and they'd eat lunch every Saturday. So much so that the waitress knew their order and would bring their drinks out to them like immediately. So after my dad died, we kept going to Cracker Barrel. I had to drive him up there on Saturday afternoons One, because the waitress would be expecting him. So, like, literally the next Saturday after mom died, we went to Cracker Barrel. And I remember that first Saturday after we were there without mom, the waitress came over and she looked at me and she said, "You look so much like your mother." And that was all it took for my dad to start crying. And then she came back and she apologized and she is like, "It is what it is." She was very nice about it. And I know her. And I was like, it's not your fault. It's
It's
just how
grief.
it's how this is, right? This is life now. But beyond that, I mean, he he just never wanted me to talk about her. And I wish I knew exactly why. I've tried to figure out exactly why, like, why could he talk about her and I couldn't? And that's something that still bugs me that I would love to know. Do you know? Do you have an I mean, like, I don't.
Oh, he's in control of his emotions when he's talking. He has control of the conversation when he's talking about it.
That's true.
He has control over what he's thinking about when he's talking about her. And so if you were to bring up a story or something, he's not ready for that.
That makes sense.
And he's not in control of the conversation.
Yeah,
He's not in control of how he views her or how he wanted to view her.
that makes sense.
At least he wanted to be in control.
Mm. He it's interesting that
And
it's really interesting that you say that because, um, and, this reminds me of something else, but, at mom's visitation, I don't know if you came to mom's visitation. I mean, mom's visitation, listen, there was, like, over 1,000 people there. I mean, it was massive. Um, like, we were supposed to start at I think it was supposed to go from, like, 4 to 8, and people were there at, like, 1:30 or 2, and we were there until, like, 9:30 at night. Um, and then the funeral the next day. But this guy came up to me, and I know this person, but this guy came up to me in the visitation line, and he said, "You know, all of this is gonna be a blur. You're not gonna remember any of this. You're not gonna remember what anybody says, anybody's face, nothing. Let me tell you about my brain. My brain, I can remember the teeniest, tiniest detail of things that happened 30 or 40 years ago. Things stick in my brain. I can remember conversations. I can remember exactly like I can't tell you what I had for lunch yesterday, but I know what I said to someone in 6th grade on the steps at Conley back in 1992. Like, I know I can because my brain works chronologically, and that's how it files information. Um, why I'm so it's why I was a history major because 'cause I'm really good at, like, that categorizing things that way. And so this guy tells me that, and which always bugged me that he said that. He also told me to not let my dad start building shrines to mom around the house. And I looked at him and I said, "It's her house. The entire house is a shrine to mom." Anyway, and I was like, "If he does, so what?" I was a little snippy. Anyway, but that we were talking about my dad and wanting to be in control. I remember the day she died. I remember it vividly. I remember what happened. I remember everything. I also kept a notebook and I wrote everything down when I gave her her medicine, when I took her vitals, everything. I kept that entire week. I kept a journal of everything, wrote everything down. Um, After she died, and when I say after she died, I mean she died at 2:30. This was like 2:35. We're still gathered around her bed. The only people that know this story were the people who were in the house, and there were a lot of people in the house. Um, there was probably about 20 people in the house when mom died. Friends, family. My dad announced to the room. I mean, he said, "Well, thank everybody for being here. I'm glad that everybody's here." And he kind of gave this little speech, and then he looked at me. And by the way, I'm just staring at my mother, and I'm crying, silently crying because my mother has just died. Okay. He looks at me because he's standing right next to me. He looks at me and he says, "Allison, is there anything you want to say?" And I'm like, I'm just, I'm just crying. I'm silently crying, but I'm crying. I can't say anything to save my life. I can't. And for some reason, he thinks he has to entertain now the people that are here. And he makes this little speech. He says a few other things. And I just, and then somebody turns to me and says, "Are you going to call the funeral home?" And I'm like, "Can I have a minute?" The same thing happened similarly when my dad died. Um, but I mean, it's like, can you give me a minute? And that's
Yeah.
kinda how I've felt in the years since mom and dad have died. It's like, with this house and with everything else, can I have a minute?
Yeah.
Can I just have a minute to process what is happening?
Just the smallest bit.
Smidge. Just a smidge to process what's going on. Because I because I couldn't. And I was sleep deprived, hadn't been eating because I remember a family friend went went to Shoney's and got me a Slim Jim sandwich. You know the Slim Jim sandwich? Um, with ham and turkey and bacon
Yeah.
and they're like, "You need to eat this." Because I hadn't eaten because I was tunnel vision focused on mom.
Yeah.
And I remember, see what I mean about details? Like I knew what sandwich they got me.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I mean, like I I I could not process it all. And it took me a very long time to even begin to process what was happening. Um, and I think I shut down, especially when my dad kept shutting me down. And I finally just gave in and just shut down, you know.
No.
Because I was like, well, you know, the only there were I can count a handful of people who were really, truly there for me after mom and dad died. I mean, like, real, true friends. Um, but it was I mean, it still is difficult, but it was so difficult dealing with that.
How many of those people allow you to have your voice?
The ones that were there for me then, um,
In you. How many people in your life allow you to have your voice?